a fairly strong reality check that I ran across, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. And it's about how the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has hastened the departure of witnesses to the horrible conflicts of the last century. We're talking about Europe. This coronavirus is depleting, eliminating the keepers of Europe's memory about the horrors that they faced, starting with World War I, and then World War II, and then the Cold War. And in the passing of so many of the keepers of memory, old folks in various countries in Europe, that is in turn allowing rising political forces in various countries in Europe, fascist forces, to recast history any way they want to. And the people who heretofore would have been there to say that's a lie, that's not what happened, are disappearing. They're dying. The ranks of those who remember so much of World War II, for example, have been diminished by COVID-19. So what I wanted to share with you is this kind of historical perspective from people who are dying. And it reading the article raised for me the question of whether or not there is some way to keep the memories of these people who lived through what transpired in Europe this past century. How do we keep that alive, especially in the age of fascism? It's kind of funny. My grandparents used to tell me that the age of fascism in Europe pretty much began with, in their opinion, Mussolini, because they were Italian, but also Franco in Spain and Hitler in Germany. They were the three most well-known provocateurs, advocates for fascist government. There were others, of course. But here's the story. And as usually the way a story begins, you start with the micro and expand to the macro, right? You start with one or two examples that affected individual people and expand your story out. So let's do that. My first character is a man named Gildo Negri. Gildo Negri. For years, this man visited schools to share his stories about blowing up bridges and cutting electrical wires to sabotage the Nazis and the fascists during World War II. And in January, this 89-year-old man made another visit. He left his nursing home outside Milan to help students plant trees in honor of Italians deported to the death camps. But at the end of February, as Europe's first outbreak of the coronavirus spread through Mr. Negri's nursing home, it infected him also. And he was shut inside this nursing home, where he grew despondent about missing the usual parades and public speeches on Italy's Liberation Day. And it was to be grander this year because it was marking the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Italy. But the virus canceled the April 25th commemorations of that day. And that night, Mr. Negri died. Rita Magnani, who worked with Mr. Negri at the local chapter of the National Association of Italian Partisans, who fought the fascists and the Nazis during World War II. But Ms. Magnani said, quote, "The memory is vanishing and the coronavirus is accelerating this process. We are losing the people who can tell us in first person what happened. And it's a shame because," she added, "when we lose the historical memory, we lose ourselves." End quote. And of course, that calls to mind, I'm sure it did for you, the expression, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, or something to that effect. But the truth is, time and its ravages have already cut down the lives and blurred the memories of a generation that saw close up the ideologies and crimes, fascism and Nazism, that turned Europe into a bloody killing field. The virus, the COVID-19 virus, which is so hideously lethal to the old, has hastened the departure of those last witnesses and forced the cancellation of anniversary commemorations that offered a final chance to tell their stories to large audiences, younger people, middle-aged people, people who weren't born when this happened in the 40s. And the virus has also created an opportunity for rising political forces who are fascist and whose objective is to erase history, to change it at least, in the same way the memory holes did for Big Brother in 1984. So these rising fascist forces are taking advantage here to recast the history of the last century so that they can play a greater role in remaking the present century. God help them all. If I believed in God, I would say that. But what's going on is throughout Europe, these radical right-wing parties with histories of Holocaust denial, infatuation with Mussolini and their fascistic motifs, these Nazis, fascists, they're gaining traction. They have been for a number of years. And they're moving from the fringes of the political spectrum into parliaments and even into governing coalitions in various countries in Europe. I'm sure you're aware of this, right? There's a party in Germany called the Alternative for Germany. And currently it's looking to capitalize on the economic frustration that this virus has triggered. In France, you have the neo-fascist National Rally that had the country's strongest showing in the last European Parliament elections. And in Italy, the birthplace of fascism, as I mentioned, I hope I'm right with that, but in Italy, the descendants of post-fascist parties have grown popular as the stigma and the horror and the disgust around Mussolini and his politics has faded. Just like I'm afraid is going to happen with the orange ape that squats in the White House in this country. Now, Italy, of course, is especially vulnerable to the loss of memory because it has the oldest population in Europe. And with the oldest population, those people are the most vulnerable, or have been, although it's changing apparently in this country, I've heard lately. But with the oldest population in Europe, Italy was the most vulnerable. And Italy also has a politically polarized country where areas of consensus in other countries are constantly litigated. It's not constantly litigated in Italy. For example, here in the United States, how many right-wingers do you know with whom you could sit down and have a conversation and convince them of the error of their ways? Huh? And these older people in Italy, the ones who are dying off with their recollections of Nazi and fascist atrocities, are now being countered by slightly younger people, say in their, well, not more than slightly younger, say in their 40s and 50s, the rising stars of these new fascist parties, with retorts of the summary executions by communist partisans. You know, where the Nazis or the fascists were taken out and shot. Not that they didn't deserve to be shot, but the argument is, well, they didn't have due process, which makes me laugh and want to use the F word liberally, because, you know, for a fascist to say, well, what about what you communists, you left-wingers did, you partisans did, when you found a group of Nazis just minding their own business, you know, drinking beer and raping Italian girls, you took them out in the woods and executed them. Shame on you. I mean, talk about a nerve, right? Anyway, in the 3/4 of a century following Italy's defeat and the de facto civil war with Mussolini's short-lived Nazi puppet state in the north, the people who lived through the war and fascism have offered a living testimony that shined through the muddle. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast, or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.